The government's first Rwanda deportation flight is tonight grounded by last-minute legal appeals. So what happens now? A spanner's thrown into the works of the government's policy for deporting asylum seekers. Boris Johnson says that if pursuing its plans means opting out of the European Convention on Human Rights, so be it. We'll discuss the latest on today's flight and whether there are alternative solutions with a former Supreme Court judge, a representative of the Rwandan government, a former Border Force chief and the UN. Also tonight, Nicola Sturgeon launches a new blueprint for Scottish independence. The SNP are in the studio to discuss it. And we've a special report on how the cost of living is impacting people in rural areas.
Politicians need to know that it's everything. It's not just, that's the cost of fuel. It's social, it's food, it's hope.
And a young writer who's scooped rave reviews for her debut novel talks to us about corruption, racism and police malpractice in urban America. Good evening. In the last few minutes, confirmation that the government's attempt to launch a new era in immigration policy has been grounded. A plane was due to leave RAF Boscombe Down about now, but as you can see, it's not going anywhere. It was meant to be bound for Kigali in Rwanda under a deal with that country called an Asylum partnership. That was signed in April as the government prepared its deportation plans. A change in the law 3 months ago now makes it an offence to arrive in this country in order to seek asylum. The new policy has support amongst a significant proportion of the population, polls would suggest, but it's brought protest and expressions of outrage from bishops, human rights groups and the UN Refugee Organisation. Successive UK court judgments upheld the legality of the flight. But tonight, the European Court of Human Rights, that's not a part of the EU, intervened in the case of one of the 7 due to fly, and that put the brakes on everything. Our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, has the story.
It was almost the last possible moment. But tonight, after every British court declined to stop the Rwanda flight, the European Court of Human Rights, to which the UK was a founding member, did instead. In a statement with regards to one of the men, an Iraqi, who the court noted may have been a victim of torture, they said, in light of the resulting risk of treatment contrary to the applicant's convention rights, as well as the fact that Rwanda is outside the convention legal space and the absence of any legally enforceable mechanism for the applicant's return to the UK, the court has decided to grant this interim measure to prevent the applicant's removal. The fact the UK and European courts came to different conclusions rests on this.
The only question is what should happen to these individuals while their case is being considered by the High Court, perhaps by the Court of Appeal, perhaps even by the Supreme Court. As far as the UK government is concerned, it's happy for them to go to Rwanda and then it will fight the case. Their lawyers will put the arguments. The Strasburg Court is not satisfied with that. It has no jurisdiction over Rwanda, of course. It's a European Court of Human Rights. So it is saying to the British government, they should stay here until the legal proceedings are over.
The asylum seekers involved maintained that their rights could not and would not be observed in Rwanda. They also told us and our BBC World Service colleagues that their own well-being was suffering as a result of the policy.
We're 3 Iranians at a deport centre in London. We feel really bad. We didn't get any sleep last night. We're really stressed out and we're not able to think clearly. Every time officers show up here, we go through hell.
Since I learned that I'm among those to be deported to Rwanda, I can hardly communicate and eat. I'm restless. I prefer to die, not to be transferred there. It's shocking.
You know, our clients have been through, I would say, unimaginable trauma in the last few weeks and very much in the last few days. They are still in detention. Their removal directions have not been cancelled as yet. They are a few of many who have been taken off already, and they remain, and they are going through some, a period of time which I can only imagine to be deeply traumatic.
The Home Office told us that all of those earmarked for deportation to Rwanda are given access to legal representation and anti-malaria medication. They added that the health and welfare of those in immigration detention is of the utmost importance to us. On a legal side, the Prime Minister himself appeared to anticipate what would happen in a clip today, mooting this.
Will it be necessary to change some laws to help us as we go along? It may very well be, and all these options are under constant review.
This has now become even more political. The ECHR, though not an EU institution but a European-wide one, has long been a source of irritation for some within the Conservative Party, and doubtless now some Conservative MPs will be urging the Prime Minister to withdraw from it. But ironically enough, Brexit and the Brexit process may have made that a little bit harder. As part of that process and the free trade agreement that was signed between the EU and the UK government gave certain assurances, made certain commitments with regards to the ECHR and its operation as part of British law. If the UK government were to suddenly say that they were withdrawing from it or significantly changing how it's applied within the UK, well, that would certainly create yet more pressure on UK-EU relations and the free trade agreement. Just at the moment, it is coming for maximal strain as part of the ongoing discussions around the Northern Ireland Protocol. But where does this leave the policy? Well, the government argued it needed to set a precedent, to establish a deterrent. Instead, until the judicial review process concludes, its flagship policy to deter channel crossings has come to little. Hundreds crossed today alone. Dozens were earmarked to be deported, and through a combination of British and European courts, day by day, that number was diminished, and now, for now, none will go at all.
Lewis Goodall there. So where do tonight's events leave the deal with Rwanda? In a moment, we'll speak to Yolande Makolo, spokesperson for the Rwandan government. But first, there's Lord Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court judge, who's going to join us now. Lord Sumption, how can it be that UK courts asked to rule on this matter in recent days have all said this policy is lawful, and then this thing is stopped by the Human Rights Court?
They haven't said that it's lawful. That's a question that's going to be decided later in July. What they've said is that no irreversible damage will be suffered by their being sent to Rwanda pending the decision of the Brits in July, because the British government has undertaken that they will be returned if they succeed.
Right, OK. So really, casting forward to the judicial review and that decision, everything now depends on that then, does it?
Well, it does, but the present issue is whether the flights should be stopped pending that decision. 3 British courts have unanimously held that no irreparable harm will be done by them having to go to Rwanda while that question is decided, given that it's going to be decided in about a month. What seems to have happened is that the Strasburg Court was more impressed by the views of the United Nations Committee on Human Rights than the British courts were.
And if the judicial review comes out with a similar decision to those previous UK ones, and says actually the policy can go ahead, that it is lawful, is that the end of it as far as the Strasburg Court is concerned, or could there be further interventions?
Well, not necessarily, because the Strasburg Court takes its own view about what human rights law requires. The current legal basis for deporting them to Rwanda is the Nationality and Borders Act, passed a few months ago, and that has reservations for cases which are contrary to the human rights of the deportees. However, it's perfectly possible, and it's happened often before, for the Strasburg Court to take a different view of what human rights law requires to that which is taken by the British courts.
And does the Prime Minister, as he seemed to be hinting today, have the power either to ignore those Strasbourg judgments or to tailor the British law in further ways to make it inapplicable in this case?
Well, that's two separate questions. He doesn't have the power to tailor British law in a different way. He's got to have parliamentary authority to do that. There would have to be a statute. But the enforceability of interim judgments of the Strasburg Court is a very controversial question. There's an article of the European Convention which requires the British government to comply with final judgments of the Strasburg Court. But this isn't a final judgment of the Strasburg Court, it's an interim judgment. And what is more, that particular article of the Convention is not one of the ones incorporated into UK law by the Human Rights Act. A more difficult question is what the position is in international law. On the face of it, there is nothing in the Convention which gives effect to interim orders of the Strasburg Court.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that insight, Lord Sumption. Thank you. Let's go now to Yolande Makolo. Look, you must have heard about this decision quite recently. What's your response to the fact that this flight will not be coming tonight? Do you expect the policy to hold up?
Well, we are undeterred. We are committed to this partnership, and we stand ready to welcome the migrants when they do arrive in Rwanda. So we'll wait to see what happens, but on our part, we are ready to receive the migrants.
Now, you probably know that there's a lot of opposition to it in the UK. People who say it's inhumane, people who say it shouldn't be happening, that it's a stain on the honour of the UK. What's your message to those people?
Well, those who say it's humane and don't have a solution to what is actually humane, and that's the suffering of people who are making these dangerous journeys and the enrichment of criminal human trafficking gangs, don't have a point. This is a solution. This partnership that we've entered into with the UK government is a solution to a very sticky problem, and we're proud to be part of an innovative solution that's seeking to end this suffering and offer people here in Rwanda a safe place to be and opportunities to live with us and develop with Rwandans.
And those people like Human Rights Watch who say, well, political opposition groups in Rwanda are subject to oppression, it's not a safe place. Do they have any point?
They have no point. That's nonsense. There's nothing wrong with living in Rwanda, and we've made a lot of progress in the last 28 years. Rwanda is
it's tough to oppose the government there, though, isn't it?
Well, there are ways to oppose the government if you want. I mean, there are people who voice their opinions on the government programs and the policies that we have, and they're free to do so. What's not allowed is to break the law, just as it is in any other country.
Yolande, you've mentioned that this is a partnership, and quite right. I read the memorandum this evening. There's clearly a financial element, but there's also a reciprocal element, isn't there, that Rwanda can send people to the UK as well with asylum cases. What sort of people are you thinking of sending to the UK?
Well, that provision refers to, extraordinary or extreme cases of vulnerable people who are not able to get the care that they need here in Rwanda. This will be determined on a case-by-case basis, and if it's assessed that they're not able to get the assistance and the care that they need here, then the UK would take them on.
Yolande Makolo, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, it's obvious enough that this issue brings plenty of heat, but to shed some light on the origins of the policy and whether there are alternative solutions, here's David Grossman at the Wall. David.
Thank you, Mark. Let's start with the cumulative number of people who arrived in small boats in the whole of last year. There's the line, the total 28,526. Now, if we put on the graphs from the previous 2 years, 2019 and 2020 there, you can see why the government is worried. 2021, vastly more people arriving. Now, let's put on the data that we've got so far for this year. It only goes up to April. That gets us to 5,000. The BBC's done some analysis and says that we're actually at about 10,000 now here in the middle of June. And if we take 10,000 from where we are now on to the end of the year, then there are forecasts that say we could end up with at least 60,000 crossings in 2022. So what do we know about the people who are arriving? Well, in 2021, we can say that 90% of small boat arrivals were male and 75% were adult men under 40. According to the Home Office, 30% of arrivals were Iranian nationals, 21% were Iraqi, 11% Eritreans and 9% Syrians. Although the most common nationality for boat arrivals this year, we are told, is from Afghanistan. And it's worth noting that although the total number of asylum applications, not just from across the Channel, but in total, has risen in recent years, if we look at this graph, there's that recent rise, but look at that over there, that peak in the early 2000s, we're nowhere near that level. Now, the country that clearly inspired the government's policy is Australia, where boats were intercepted and occupants transferred to third countries for asylum processing. And it's not just the UK that is looking to emulate that sort of policy. Earlier this month, the Danish Parliament approved an offshore asylum law. According to the Danish government spokesperson, if you apply for asylum in Denmark, you know that you will be sent back to a country outside Europe, and therefore we hope that people will stop seeking asylum in Denmark. And while that law was going through the Danish Parliament, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, was trying to get an agreement with Spain to take asylum seekers, or at least there were the reports coming out of Washington, although there has been no official confirmation of that from the White House as yet. But how much will that sort of policy work? How much will the UK's Rwanda policy deter small boat arrivals?
The expectation is that a relatively small share of people will be sent to Rwanda. It raises the question, will people just see this as one more risk on top of the many risks that they have already taken along their asylum journey, in which case you perhaps wouldn't expect it to have a huge impact.
So what are the alternative solutions to end those dangerous channel crossings? Well, the Labour Party says the government should work with the French government to stop the people smugglers upstream. But that, of course, requires agreement with the French government. Labour's other proposal is to open what it calls our safe and legal routes for people to claim asylum in the UK. But that, of course, raises a question. What would that do to numbers? Would more people want to come to the UK? And if so, how many?
These are exactly the kind of issues that I think these policies have to grapple with. You know, will there be any selection criteria? What will happen to people who aren't successful in that? And I think at this stage, because this debate is really in its infancy, and there aren't that many examples actually either of offshoring or of safe routes around the world, it's something that I think in practice would probably be a matter of trial and error.
Now, those sorts of questions and the government's legal difficulties, as evidenced with events today, has led some to conclude that the government's real objective isn't removals or even deterrence. It's political, to convince worried voters that something concrete is being done and to provide a so-called wedge issue with opposition parties. Mark.
Thank you, David. Well, joining us now are Gillian Triggs, the Assistant Commissioner for the Protection of Refugees at the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, and former Chief Immigration Officer Kevin Saunders. Gillian, let's start with you. Look, this partnership, is an agreement between two sovereign governments, Rwanda and the UK. So what's the problem with it in your view?
Well, the essential problem with it is twofold. Firstly, we're very concerned that it breaches the international obligation for every country to allow an asylum seeker to have their claim assessed on a speedy and fair system within that country where protection has been sought. So when we see the United Kingdom essentially avoiding that responsibility and shifting it across to another country, in this case a country 6,000 kilometres away in Africa, that we believe is inconsistent with the obligations that the United Kingdom, of course, led with in negotiating with the Refugee Convention just after the Second World War. So we're very disappointed, of course, at that approach. But the other argument, and the other one that I think it needs to be considered as well as the legal, is the moral. And that is that these are people, for the most part, who are absolutely desperate for protection. And we believe that the United Kingdom is well placed to manage those numbers. The point perhaps particularly made in the context of the Ukraine crisis.
But the Immigration and Borders Act in April has made it an offence to come here with the purpose of seeking asylum in the UK. And we must assume that has superseded that long-standing pledge under the convention that you mentioned. And we know also that Denmark, other countries are looking at making similar changes. Isn't it just the case that those old assumptions are no longer valid?
No, these aren't assumptions at all. These are treaty obligations under international law that the United Kingdom has not only negotiated and signed up to in 1951, but has been a most significant global leader in implementing over these last 70 years. So this is really exceptional. And but at a technical level, these are legal obligations by which the United Kingdom is bound. And there is simply no other way around that. To pass domestic laws that will conflict with it, as plainly this new legislation does or purports to do, is really already countered by the European Court of Human Rights, which of course is looking at it from a perspective of that regional law. We at the UN Refugee Agency, of course, are concerned that these fundamental norms that have really underpinned the international legal system for the last 75 years since the Second World War really should be upheld and not disregarded in this way.
But maybe the scale of the issue now is forcing change. It's just not possible to maintain a 75-year-old system of principles in that way.
Well, I think we of course, you make a good point. When the Refugee Convention was negotiated, there were about 2 million so-called displaced people by the horrors of the Second World War. And that was the intention, frankly, at the time, to mop up that number and find them a safe haven. Today, we have announced, the High Commissioner for Refugees has announced over 100 million people now are forcibly displaced, either within their own country or across national boundaries seeking protection. So you make a fair point. So what needs to be changed? We need to have a faster and fairer asylum systems to determine who is a refugee, who is not.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm sorry to jump in because I want to bring in Kevin Saunders, who I probably should have brought in sooner. But Kevin, I mean, you've seen the difficulties that they had this evening. At one point, the plane was going to take off with one person on it, a £500,000 flight. Is it really worth the trouble?
Good evening. Yes, it is worth the trouble. Our asylum system is broken. As your previous guest said, we've got 100 million refugees throughout the world. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom cannot operate an open door policy. We have got to control who is coming into the UK. Now, the people arriving in the boats, they're taking their own lives at risk. They're putting their own lives at risk. They're putting Border Force officers' lives at risk because they're the people that have to save them from in the middle of the channel. It's just not feasible. We have got to have something. This policy would have said, OK, come across the channel in a boat. You then have a very distinct possibility of going to Rwanda. That would have stopped a lot of these people coming.
There is a judicial review underway. We were hearing about that earlier from Lord Sumption, and in 3 weeks' time, we'll know whether or not this policy can continue. But if the answer is that it can't, what are the other options, do you think, in the government's toolbox to try and deal with the issue of these boats?
Well, the ideal answer would be actually get a deal with the European Union. But at the moment, that is proving very, very difficult. The French in particular are playing politics, and they won't deal with us over an effective policy of stopping these people leaving France.
Well, they're desperate as well, aren't they? That's part of the problem. They are desperate people, and it's very hard ultimately to have a fully effective system that will stop them.
The French could do an awful lot more. We have been saying for some considerable time that joint patrols in the Channel between Border Force, the Royal Navy, and the French Gendarmerie Maritime would stop virtually all these boats coming across. But the French won't sign up to this.
All right. Kevin Saunders, Gillian Trigg, thank you both indeed very, very much. Now,